Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome here at the Blavatnik School of Government. My name is Annette and I'm Associate Professor in Global Security here. And I'm also directing the Minerva Global Security Program, where we look at contested spaces, illicit flows, and order in the contemporary world. And as part of that program, it's my pleasure to have a very distinguished guest here with us today, who works on a very related issue, of course, related to security, to understanding order in the contemporary world. And so it was quite obvious that we would be really thrilled to host him here. Our guest is Professor Robert Rotberg. He's the President Emeritus of the World Peace Foundation. He was the founding director of the program on intrastate conflict at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Previously, he was professor of political science at MIT in Boston, and he was also academic vice president of Tufts University and president of Lafayette College. He has authored numerous books. I wouldn't be able to list them all here and all the work that he's written, but they concern different regions, different parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, Latin America. And in terms of the themes, he's worked on corruption, on governance, on failed states, and of course also on South Africa and Africa in general, which is also what we're hearing about today. So today we are very excited to launch his new book, which is called Overcoming the Oppressors: How Africans Ended White Rule, Endured Oppression from Their Own, and Overcame African Oppressors. And I hope I can just briefly show you the book. So I highly recommend it. Make sure you get a copy of it. And we very much look forward now to hear from Professor Rotberg directly about the book. So we'll hear about 30 minutes maybe, and then there's lots of time also for questions, for comments, and we hope that we can engage in a very lively discussion. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Eidler. It's a great privilege to be here again. I spoke about a book on corruption in 2017, and the new book, Overcoming the Oppressors, which Oxford across the street is not, doesn't have copies sitting right out here, which they should do. But there is one copy at Blackwell's. This book is also about corruption, as I'll mention in a moment. Anyway, I'm delighted. Thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure on my part to introduce a book which may be of interest to each of you. From my point of view, and I hope from yours, and there's at least one person in the audience that's read the book already and can comment further. This is a book about 5 related but different issues. They're related because they're about the future of Southern Africa, as well as the past of Southern Africa. But first of all, this is a book inspired by Frantz Fanon and inspired by his prescient observations in 1958 that Black power was not a solution, more of a way station to the independence of Africa in general. Now, Frantz Fanon was a Martinican. He was a psychiatrist who had lived through the Algerian War and had lived in Senegal. And his view, his acute predictions about what Africans might do with liberation were long overlooked. And this book is in small part, but important part, an attempt to bring Frantz Fanon's observations back to us. And the book is Overcoming the Oppressors, because this is about overcoming the white oppressors. And now, as we've seen, and I'll come back to this, as we've seen in the last 12 months, 24 months in Zambia. It's about overcoming Black oppressors as well. And I want to say that quite starkly. It's not often that one wants to put this as starkly as I have. So Frantz Fanon was the progenitor of the book in many ways. But second, it's a book about what happened from 1959 to 2002 in Southern Africa. And so one part of the book is about how Africans eventually shut down the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which was one of the great hoaxes that the British government, particularly a Labour British government, perpetrated, and later with the help of the Tories, on the peoples of Central Africa, as they called it. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, nowadays, in those days, the Rhodesias and Nyasaland. And I've published elsewhere an article called The Hoax of the Federation. I can't remember the exact title, in the Journal of Southern African Studies. And basically it shows the kinds of things that the Labour and then the conservative governments talked themselves into to justify taking independence away from Africans in Central Africa for a good decade. Now, Africans, the drive to the Federation of Central Africa began immediately after World War II. And Africans understood what was happening, but many Britons, including Britons in high office, believed that there could be a way that whites could partner with Africans to create a federal structure which would avoid independence, avoid Mau Mau, and avoid apartheid creeping up northward from South Africa into Zimbabwe. But the key architect on the Zimbabwe side, Sir Godfrey Huggins, gave it all away in 1951, 2 years before Federation was enacted, when he said, look, this is a partnership between the rider and the horse. And we will be the riders. Don't worry about anything. We will be the riders. And Africans will gradually become riders, maybe over 30, 40 years. So he gave it away in a speech in middle part of Zimbabwe. And that was echoed during his premiership of the Federation. He and Sir Roy Walensky, who succeeded him, were quite clear that this was a white attempt to circumvent African home rule and independence. And notice the dating here. 1953 was shortly after apartheid was created by National Party victory in South Africa, and also shortly after the Gold Coast, Ghana, moved to independence, and people in Southern Africa, whites in Southern Africa, were worried about African independence. Sudan in 56, Ghana in 58. And so these were worries that the whites who had tried for 20, 30 years to create an amalgamation of the territories. Now, why the Federation? Zambia had copper, Zimbabwe had tobacco and lots of whites. And so the whole story of the Federation was getting these three territories funded by Zambian copper. And that's pretty much what happened for a decade, 53 to 63. So part of the book, the beginning part of the book is about how Africans, Dr. Banda, Kenneth Kaunda, various others resisted federation, failed to thwart it, and then succeeded eventually 10 years later in the early 1960s in removing federation as an option. And Ian MacLeod, colonial secretary, was a key figure. He finally tumbled to the notion that Britain could not hold on to these Central African territories forever. And it was better to go with Dr. Banda. In 1961, there was an election. In 64, Malawi became independent under Banda's what turned out to be dictatorial leadership. And that's another part of the story. That is 1964 to 1993, Kamuzu Banda, who died in his upper 90s, held Malawi in totally captive in his hand, persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses, made American Peace Corpsmen cut their hair, banned all kinds of important journals like People magazine, because it showed women in the magazine, and ran a very tight operation that was prejudicial to Africans, banned the growing of various crops that Africans depended upon, decided that groundnuts could no longer be grown, and ran a very tightly controlled country. But my book also talks about the liberation of South Africa. And so there's several chapters about about apartheid, of course, about the cruelties of apartheid, but also about how Nelson Mandela proceeded to make himself South Africa's jailer, so that it took a number of years. He first had to gain complete legitimacy within the Soweto jailed offenders of apartheid, and he had to consolidate his rule in the African National Congress on Robben Island. And then he made it very clear to the South African government that started negotiating with him in 1985, possibly 1984, that he was in charge. They were not in charge. And so that the only way forward in South Africa was through a complete commitment to independence and to his unjailing and to the freeing up of the ANC comrades who were on Robben Island. But he first had to win the legitimacy on Robben Island, which he did relatively quickly. But another person who features in my chapters on South Africa, among the whites who opposed apartheid, Helen Suzman was critical because she managed to visit Mandela on a regular basis and managed to keep his legitimacy and his spirit alive within South Africa broadly. So she and Black Sash, opponents of apartheid, were very critical. There's also a section in the book about Bob Sobukwe, who should be given more credit than he has been given for his part in the South African freedom struggle. And in Tato Matlana, Steve Biko, and many others. And there's also a critical section on the way in which de Klerk's epiphany came about and how he realized largely because of what was happening in the American financial markets, that apartheid was doomed. And so his releasing of Mandela, he really had no choice in 89, 90, when he became head of the party and then president. He had no choice. But by then, apartheid had become the dead end it always was. For part of this period, I was a prohibited immigrant in South Africa. So I could, for several years, I could only look at it from nearby or outside. And then finally, one day, this is one of the ironies that I like to, that's mentioned in the book, close academic South African friends of mine said, we'll get around this banning. Transkei has just become independent. So if you come to a conference in Transkei, you'll have to go through Johannesburg and they'll have to let you go to Transkei. And therefore, you will have passed through South Africa. And so I did this and went to Transkei for a conference on something or other, and then was going back through Johannesburg to Namibia. And I was put in jail, as it were, in the airport. And, but fortunately, through the help of the US State Department, I spent the next day in Pretoria in front of Connie Mulder, who had banned me. And he had in front of me, in front of him, a stack of documents saying, this is why you were banned. And I said, show them to me so that I can refute them. He said, no, I can't do that. They're not my documents. And so eventually, he said, you can spend overnight at the airport and then go to Namibia the next day. And so I went straight into town and had dinner with friends and political talk, and the unbanning happened without it ever happening. So that was one country. I was also banned in Zimbabwe for a decade, and I'll talk about that maybe in a minute. So there's much in the book about the South African political struggle, particularly about the importance of the United Democratic Front, the internal opposition in the 80s, particularly to apartheid, and with American financial shifts were important, but also the pressure on the National Party and the South African government of what the UDF, Cyril Ramaphosa being one of the key people in it, and what they were doing with sabotage and so on was also very important. And there's much in the book about that. Now, thirdly, the book examines how liberation led initially everywhere but Botswana to self-defeating policies like nationalization and single-partiness, which really consumed much of this region outside of South Africa, which was still under apartheid. So that Zambia made horrendously poor choices in the late 60s, but also mostly in the 1970s, when they decided to nationalize copper just at the point where copper was declining in value. The Vietnam War was winding down, and so the demand for copper was decreasing. And so Zambia nationalized its only resource, its only major resource, just at the point when they couldn't sell it. And at that point, 96% of Zambian foreign exchange depended on copper. It's far less now. And then the management of the mines shifted from Anglo-American South Africa and Rhone Climax, so American Metal Climax, which owned the mines. And of course, the management of the mines then became a political vehicle for extreme patronage. So you then had mismanagement on top of really faulty economic policy. And Kenneth Kaunda was president from 1964 to 1991. Kenneth Kaunda was a marvelous human being, a humanist who had published his own little red book of humanist sayings and humanist ideology. He and I became very close friends, as the book discusses, and we saw each other frequently because in 1959, within a couple of weeks of going from Oxford to Zambia, I interviewed this young man that no one had heard of and published in the New York Times an article in February about the new leader of Zambia, about to replace Harry Nkambula as the key political figure. And 3 weeks later, he was arrested and an emergency was declared. And in Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, party politics was closed down for a year, in some cases 2 years, in other cases. So I was fortunate to get to see him in Chilenji Hut 325, which is a national shrine, and to interview him there, to publish about him. And we kept in close touch really through through the early part of this century. In fact, Sue and I visited him and interviewed him long after his presidency. He was a truly gentle and well-meaning person who was misled by, of all people, Julius Nyerere, who became an Afro-socialist before Kaunda realized what that was. And so Kaunda followed Nyerere. They were similar people, gentle, kind, well-intended people. But Nyerere had nationalized the sisal plantations. Kaunda nationalized the copper mines. Nyerere had declared a single-party state. Zambia followed suit. Kenya was single-party, and there were many other places. So this book is about what happened after liberation was achieved and how bad choices were made. And the bad choices led to massive corruption. Corruption that we really haven't seen any place but South Africa since, South Africa was captured, and there's something in the book about the Zuma years and state capture. But the important thing is places like Malawi, which had never really experienced pilfering and embezzlement and so on. South Africa had always had this, so it's not new in South Africa, but in Malawi and Zambia, it was new, and in Zimbabwe, it was mostly new, and the extent of the trading influence for cash became very important, so that possibly, this is hard to estimate in retrospect, but possibly as much as 3% of GDP was squandered due to corruption in these territories. The figures that I use when I talk about corruption worldwide are 1 and 2%. The World Bank uses a figure of 1 trillion lost to corruption over a decade. it was certainly large in every part of Southern Africa during this period and until today, in South Africa, of course, and in Zimbabwe, and less so in Zambia, we hope, thanks to the new president, and in Malawi, possibly because of the new president, so that corruption actually destroys incentives in many ways, changes priorities for the worse, as well as actually taking money away from the people, taking roads away from the people, taking and so on. There was one person who later became president of Malawi who sold maize forward just before a famine and bought it, had to purchase it back at great profit, which she took during the famine. Things like that, and one could aggregate the exact amounts lost to corruption. I was in Malawi very often in the 90s, running a Harvard project to improve the economy of Malawi. And the finance minister was Aleki Banda, who was a close friend of many years standing. There was still a lot of corruption, and the president of Malawi at the time, Bakili Maluzi, had managed to control the trucking, all the trucking in Malawi. And so he monopolized sugar sales and rice sales. So he had a bonanza. And I would see him every Monday night after dinner. And from Monday after Monday after Monday, I would say, Mr. President, sir, you said you were going to denounce corruption and bring it to an end. When are you going to do it? And his answer day after day, week after week, was next Monday for sure. And if any of you know Nadine Gordimer's short stories, you'll know there's a short story called Next Monday for Sure, which is about the revolution, different subject. So there was endless corruption, and Maluzi was, of course, tried much later in Malawi for stealing himself. But the important point here is that governance became an afterthought. Public interest was discarded. Institutions that were left over from British rule were destroyed systematically in every country, as they still are in Zimbabwe. And as I said, even a fine person like Kaunda succumbed to an Afro-socialism, which was meaningless. It really had no content, but was the excuse for single-party rule, for one-man rule, for corruption, and so on. And so his corruption, his humanism was basically cliches, and his little red book was full of aphorisms that were similar but less pernicious than Mao's little red book, but they were of the same order. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but the exception to everything I've said was Botswana. Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana, resisted everything I've mentioned. He resisted corruption systematically, resisted a single party state, even though his party has always won elections, but he resisted one-man rule. And fast forward to Festus Mogoe, University College, Oxford graduate, and third president of Botswana. I went to him one day. We knew each other well. I went to him one day and I said, the chancellor, vice chancellor of the University of Botswana has resigned. Who are you going to appoint? Now, every other president, particularly Mugabe, would have said, I don't know, I'll decide. He said, I have no idea. I don't really make the appointments. The university trustees make the appointment, the university board. And I said, but Mr. President, that's very unusual. He said, yes, and we intend to keep it that way in this country. Seretse Khama resisted motorcades. And my advice to anyone studying Africa is look at the length of the motorcades. Because if the motorcades are 1 and 2 cars long, you know you have a good country. If the motorcades, as they were in Malawi, were 40 or 50 cars long, with the roads cleared so Dr. Banda could move without any hindrance, you know you're in a very difficult country. Seretse Khama refused to let anyone travel first class when they went to conferences in Africa. So Vice President Masiri, who later became president, was in the back of an Ethiopian air flight to a conference in Addis Ababa. And he didn't get off quickly enough. So they rolled up the red carpet because he was traveling coach, and no one in important position except from Botswana travels coach. And that was one of Seretse Khama's ways of resisting what was happening in Ghana, what was happening in Tanzania, what was happening in Malawi. And even he went to North Korea and was horrified. This was in the 1970s. And he was particularly horrified what Kamuzu Banda was doing in Malawi. This is a book about leadership as well, about the difference between expediency and integrity, about the lack of numeracy among the leaders of Africa. And except for Seretse Khama and maybe the new president of Zambia, the lack of any transformational instincts. Everyone else has been transactional. And all you have to do is look at Jacob Zuma and you see a transactional president, but all the others were too. They didn't understand Frederick Chiluba, who succeeded Kaunda, Michael Sata, who was one of the Zambian presidents, Edgar Lungu, who I think is being tried for corruption right now in Zambia. All these were transactionalists. And then there's a section also about Thabo Mbeki here and about his decision to surf the web and reject the notion that HIV/AIDS was a dangerous disease transmitted sexually, and set back the cure, well, not the cure, the remediation of HIV/AIDS in South Africa by a good 2 or 3 years, with lots of lives lost, thanks to his obstinacy and his belief in alternative methods found on the web. And his minister of health, a woman whose name I'm forgetting, said it's okay. The cure is garlic. The more garlic you eat, you'll be secure. And that was among the idiocies that were happening. Fourth, and I will close shortly. Fourth, this is a book. This is a very Oxford story. A young researcher becomes infused with Africa, caught up in several liberation struggles, assumes the best for post-liberation future, and then watches and laments those early hopes become disappointments. I went off from Univ in St. Anthony's in the first days of 1959, came back a year later, having been a participant in the beginnings of the liberation struggles of Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on, later Namibia. And that was great, and came back to Oxford, which was, how can I say this, deficient in African studies at the time, and found a way to complete the DPhil and to move on, but it was a very heady time. So it's an Oxford story, and it's a story, as I mentioned, about being banned and being unbanned, and about all the impressive personalities that I met in Africa. So it's a very African story, because there's something about Morgan Tsvangirai in the book, Sam Nyoma, and a close friend, Masuku Chippembery, who was one of the great founders of nationalism in Malawi, who died young, and whose book, Hero of the Nation, was something I helped edit to get it published. Now, finally, the end of the book, the end of the critical chapters is very hopeful. It's hopeful about the present and the future. I wrote a book in 2020 called Things Come Together, Africans Achieving Greatness. And I think that is beginning to happen in a few places in Africa, and particularly in Zambia, possibly in Malawi. And although a lot of people are unhappy with the way Cyril Ramaphosa has been guiding South Africa, having known him fairly closely in the 90s, I still have hopes that Ramaphosa is going to manage to overcome the African National Congress and transform the African National Congress and lead South Africa into the new Zion. But we'll have to see on that. Thank you very much. That's okay.
Here.
No.
I'll take one for myself as well.
That's a como combiri.
Please. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the fascinating talk. We have time for questions. Oops. Thank you so much. We have time for questions, comments. I know we also have an audience online, YouTube, so I will see if I receive questions here as well on the iPad. But I would like to take the privilege of the chair and ask the first questions. And in the meantime, feel free to think already about other comments. I would like to follow up on what you mentioned about bad choices leading to corruption, and of course linking that to the struggle for independence. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about those specific pathways or the mechanisms that you've detected, because of course we know that corruption is not just present in countries with colonial history, but also in others and in very different contexts, right? If you think about Eastern Europe, or these days Ukraine is in the kind of in the spotlight. So how would you say those bad choices that come from this past really lead to corruption, also knowing that, as you mentioned, Botswana was really different in that context?
I'm editing a book at the moment on measuring corruption. And there's a chapter in the book by a professor at Sussex on UK corruption. So everybody is infected, some more than others. And there's Eugene Vindman has a chapter in the book also on corruption in Ukraine. So it's everywhere, particularly in the United States since Trump became president some years ago. But your question's a very important one. Corruption fish rot from the head. Corruption starts at the top. There's no corruption anywhere which seeps up. It's always permitted. It's always permissive. We could make Oxford a corrupt constabulary if the leaders of the constabulary decided that they wanted to be on the take, and then there'd be opposition, there'd be court case and so on. But the people down below in Zimbabwe knew from the 90s certainly that Mugabe and everyone close to him, including the current president, Emerson Mnangagwa, were stealing blindly from the people. So naturally, the person at the airport who asked me for a small gift as I was leaving the airport knew that he could get away with it. And he also knew that 10-20% of what he collected had to go up to the inspector in the police, who in turn had to give it to the chief commissioner and so on. So that's one answer. It always starts from the top. And so when Kaunda in Zambia in 1967 didn't stop some of his people from trading influence for profit, everyone else said, well, if he can do it, she can do it. I should do it. Otherwise, I'm losing out. Otherwise, I'm not getting my share. And Michaela Wrong wrote a great book, It's My Turn to Eat. And that's a common phrase throughout Africa, so that there are, the other part of the answer is corruption is not structural. It's not contingent. It's human choice. So that makes it something that Lee Kuan Yew could stop very easily by discharging his deputy prime minister for peculation. And then he discharged another cabinet minister, and then he discharged a important functionary whose wife was wearing jewelry that he knew the man could not afford. So once that happened, and the same thing, Seretse did much the same in Botswana, and that's, I don't want to commend Kagame, but Kagame's kept corruption out of Rwanda for much the same methods, and I don't want to say anything commendatory about Kagame, but Lee is the model for being able to reduce and then eliminate corruption very readily by cutting off, making sure the top was clean, and Seretse did the same. And as you know from reading the press, this certainly never happened in South Africa. And the state capture is so blatant. And what Zuma and the Guptas did is so outrageous that you wonder how they thought they could escape from censure. And Ace Magashule says he's starting a new party or joining the Economic Freedom Fighters, and we'll see what happens there. But there's another corrupt individual.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I see there are questions in the audience. Let's take the one in the back first. Yeah?
Sure. I'm a DPhil student here. The first thing is what you said a lot about, what you said a lot resonate with me in two ways before I ask my question. So the first way is I grew up in Burma, Myanmar. So all the things you said about how after the independence, the post-independence leaders sort of wasted the opportunities to set the country in a more prosperous path. I mean, that I grew up in Burma, and that's almost exactly like the way that you laid out. The second resonance is recently the motorcade, the length of motorcade that you mentioned. Recently, I was in Nigeria and Ghana, and if you compare the length of motorcade in Nigeria for VIPs with the length of motorcade that you see in Ghana, you can easily tell what kind of the different path, the relative different path the two countries are going. Now, my question is, I could see that you were saying that the difference, especially in regards to Botswana in Southern Africa, the main difference of Botswana compared to other Southern African countries is the leadership. It's a function of the leadership. The leadership can set the tone, and the leadership can make differences in choice. I'm a little bit more interested in contextual factors. Are there, in your book or in your experience, any contextual and any role for like the differences in context that enable leaders in one context to make different choices compared to leaders in another context? Or are you going to say, well, the structural factors don't really matter? The leaders, especially the executives, always have choices that they can make.
That's a very good question. Kaunda thought that he was doing the right thing by eliminating political participation. And anyone that's read Robert Dahl or studying democracy knows that political participation is absolutely critical. Kaunda hadn't read Dahl, didn't understand, and he thought that Nyerere and Kenyatta, to some extent, were on the right path because most of Africa was eliminating political participation. And so the executive committee of the party decided everything. And so it was a choice in his case, in Nyerere's case, made for ostensibly positive reasons that development would be enhanced by having less choice and less participation, and that the leaders could really go forward and decide the best way to develop. But as we know, that political participation is absolutely critical, and giving people choice, you get feedback. You get an awareness of what works and what doesn't work and what really satisfies the public and what legitimizes the rule of the leadership. So what Kaunda did for most of his 27 years was forfeit legitimacy for autocracy. So he was reelected, but there wasn't any opposition most of the time. And his only challenger was his best friend, Kapwepwe, Simon Kapwepwe, who stood against Kaunda and lost and eventually died rather young. But Kapwepwe was already corrupt and felt that he wasn't getting a big enough share of the spoils. So that election was about that. Now, Myanmar is very interesting because UNU made a series of bad choices, and he rejected his own idea of how to modernize, and he gave way to Ne Win, and then Burma really fell apart, and we haven't recovered yet. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who I had the privilege of spending some time with during a few weeks when she was out of house arrest in the 90s, Aung San Suu Kyi didn't really have, when she became chancellor and leader of Myanmar, didn't really have an understanding of what her choices were and what legitimacy meant, because I think she could have made major differences in, and so what we're having in Myanmar right now is a struggle for the first time where the ethnic 40% of Myanmar is joined with the professional and student classes in an attempt to move Myanmar back to where it was, and then so it could go forward back to 1948, when Aung San Suu Kyi's father created Burma after the Japanese occupation. So leadership is critical.
Thank you so much. Let's take two questions at a time because we don't have that much time left. Frederick, please, and then in the front.
Yes, also a DPhil student here. And I am wondering, I have two questions. My first question is a bit whether you could elaborate on the implications of the current international system and the Ukraine war on corruption currently, and how also, the United States plays a role in maybe facilitating and enabling it because of competing interests. And my second question is, when is that measuring corruption volume coming out, if I may ask?
So I didn't, tell me again.
When you mentioned an edited volume that you are editing currently. I was just curious about when we might be able to expect it.
Oh,
when we can invite you back for a book launch of that one. Let's take the other question also, just for the interest of time. Please.
I was just going to ask, to what extent would you view kind of the nature of modern oppression in Africa as very much being a product of the colonial encounter? Or would you say it's quite, kind of the causes for it are not directly linked to that, and we should be looking in other places for why it's happening?
Okay. Routledge 2024, I hope somewhere around March or April, but depends on Routledge. But it'll be published in the UK, and it has a number of very good essays, including by Professor Petherick from the Blavatnik School,
Right.
plus a number of others, including what I hope is going to be a very important chapter on Indonesian corruption. Nothing on Burma, unfortunately, but it's in the first question, just a lot of what the donors have done has contributed to largesse, which has led to the misuse of donated money, and therefore to putting in people's pockets. And the best book on that is Thieves of State, Sarah Shays' book about Afghanistan, where she can document the enormous amount of money that went straight from US well-meant donations, taxpayer, my taxes were shoveled right into Karzai and many other Ashraf Ghani and so on, all kinds of horrendous bits of foolishness. And but we can go back to misguided developmental decisions to the groundnut scheme, which was British government, whatever became before DFID in the 1960s. And so there's a lot of well-meant but badly designed international interventions. And Bill Easterly has a book, forgetting the title at the moment, but and Dumisu, Zambian author, sorry, yeah, Moyo, has very critical of what aid has done. And Easterly's view is we should just have no aid at all because most of it is squandered. I think that goes a little bit too far, but because there's some CETA aid and some Norwegian aid that is instrumental, but it's the fact that the aid giver's job has been to pour out the aid rather than to make sure it was used well. And that's been an immense part of the problem over the years. And privatization turns out to be much better than just distributing aid willy-nilly. Your question again was?
Just about kind of whether you think there's much of a causal link between kind of the colonial encounter.
Oh yeah, go on. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely yes, and absolutely no. Look, it's been 70 years in many countries. You know, that's enough time to get your act together. And Botswana is a testament to the fact that it's only now that Seretse Khama's, the political culture that Seretse Khama introduced in the 1960s and lasted until his death in 1979, and then continued under magnificent man Sir Kedemili Masiri until Festus Mogae took over in 2002. That political culture that was introduced into Botswana is only now eroding, so that, and part of it happened because Seretse's son, who was the fourth president of Botswana, for various reasons which I don't fully understand, was a closet autocrat. So despite his father's influence, he really wanted to do things differently in Botswana. He opposed Mugabe and Zimbabwe thoroughly, but he also wanted more power for himself. And this has led to some eroding of the political culture and the ethos that distinguishes Botswana from the rest. So on the other hand, certainly colonial rule was never reached the point of effective transfer of institutions to indigenous rulers. So the deficiency of colonial rule is that there was lip service paid everywhere to transfer of technology, transfer of ideas, but most of the ideology was imposed and the institutions were imposed. They weren't intrinsic to the countries as they were emerging from colonial rule. So that's the negative side. The plus side is an educated class, which was small, but which came the Fort Hare cadre in South Africa, the Manali cadre in Zambia, an elite that was ready for independence and should have been eased into it rather than battled over it.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We're running out of time. I think we could have continued for a long time, but we need to stop here. I'd like to thank you again very much for your talk, and please also join me in thanking Professor Rotberg. And don't forget to buy a copy of the book.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much.